This is the Rental Rookie Podcast, Show 002.
Welcome to the Rental Rookie Podcast. Get inspired and get perspective from realtors, lenders, contractors, and other investors just like you. Now your host, Emily Duplessis.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Rental Rookie Podcast. I'm excited to bring you another show today focused on investing in buy and hold properties. You know, we're a few shows into the podcast now, and I really, truly hope that you've been able to take away something new from each of the shows. Even if it's just one thing, maybe it's 5 or 10 things, but I really hope that as you walk away and after each show, you're able to take one golden nugget, as my mother-in-law calls it, away as something new that you've learned about. Here at Rental Rookie, we're all about sharing our knowledge and experiences with novice investors to show you that it isn't actually as scary or intimidating to invest in rental properties as you think it may be. That's really one of our goals, so that I hope in the couple of shows that we've had and in the future shows that we're able to, share with you what we've been through, our trials, our successes, to help you see that it really is something that anybody can do. It really is a great way to build wealth and to earn passive income. So, without further ado, today's show is going to be all focused on financing and primarily on traditional financing. My husband and I listen to a lot of podcasts, and a lot of times we find ourselves getting frustrated when we're listening because we're always going, well, how did they do it? How did they, what are the numbers? How did they get financing? What type of financing did they get? So I kind of thought to start off here on one of our early shows that it would be really good to talk about traditional financing. How are you able to get money, borrow money from the bank, and use that to start building your rental portfolio? It really is an area of the investing field that I think is pretty intimidating if you're new to it, especially if you're coming into it with no prior knowledge on anything related to finance or real estate. The financing aspect can be a hard nut to swallow, and I think that it's really important that you know where your money go and you know what your options are. So I thought it would be beneficial today to bring on somebody who knows quite a bit about the investing aspect in traditional financing. If you've been on my blog at all, rentalrookie.com, which I hope that you've been there, and read anything about us, you've learned that I'm not a sole real estate investor. It is my husband and I together. We're a team, and we started it a couple of years ago, and so we are loving it, enjoying it. We've had our share of successes. We've had a few bumps in the road, but we really kind of got started all because of him and his want to get into this. I knew nothing about real estate or financing. He was our numbers guy, and he really kind of took the bull by the horns. If I'm the bull, I don't know, I don't know. But anyways, he was the one who really got us going in it. So Kirk, who's here with us today on the podcast.
Hey everyone.
He actually is a certified mortgage planner. His family actually has been in the business for over 30 years. He's worked on a team with his mom and his dad. And so he knows the ins and outs when it comes to financing, when it comes to qualifying, different loan programs. I've learned a ton just being around him and being around his family. Listening to the phone calls that he's on, I've been able to learn a lot. But I thought it would be great to bring him on today. So welcome, Kirk.
It's good to be here finally.
So Kirk, why don't you share with us, how does somebody get started with their first property?
So, getting started with your first investment property, I think for a lot of people, it can be scary, right? And I know that I've dealt with a lot of investors working in the mortgage business, and me and my family have done, consistently $60 million a year in production. So we do a lot of business, and we work with a handful of investors, a lot of first-time investors, but also, some repeat investors. And that's really where we kind of got, our education in how to finance, right, is learning how to solve problems for these people buying their first property. And so I think when you buy your first property coming from either a single income or a dual income household, the biggest thing and the biggest fear for people is always qualifying. And one of the things I told Emily, and as we get started and we tell a lot of other investors that we meet, is that qualifying isn't as hard as you might think, or as you think it might be for your first property. It's just knowing your numbers, right? And so the first thing that any bank is going to look at when we talk about traditional financing for an investment property is really just kind of asking yourself, are you able to carry or handle both payments at the same time? So not only the payment on the new rental property that you're buying, but also are you able to carry the payment on your current place and that place at the same time? And I think that's really a key distinction, because when you look at that, that's the number one question that people are always worried about, is being able to carry both of those properties. And as a bank, when banks and mortgage companies are looking at you to possibly give a loan to on this property, you've got to remember that this is their first loan with you and this is your first rental property. So they're not going to assume that you're going to rent this thing out. They're not going to assume that you're going to have a bunch of cash flow coming in from a tenant. They're going to take the worst case scenario and assume that you need to carry and hold that property like it's never rented out for at least 2 years. And so that's one of the real big distinctions when it comes to getting started with your first property.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I just want to clarify for the audience, you're talking about when somebody already owns their own home, like they live in, they own a home, owner occupant, and they're going to buy the second one, correct?
Right. But also, as a bank, what we're going to look at is, and I'm acting like I'm speaking like a bank because I'm not a bank, but as a bank, when I would talk to clients, one of the things we're going to look at is if you own your own home and you want to buy a new investment property, we're going to want you to qualify and be able to have the income that sustains both of those payments. But if you don't own your home, we also want to know, what are you renting the place that you're living in now, right? So we're still going to qualify you, assuming that rental payment that you're making if you're buying this new investment property without first owning your home. So in all cases, the bank wants to make sure that you can qualify for both payments and that you're well, qualified. You don't have too much debt. Your income can sustain kind of the worst case scenario.
And really, the bank's looking out for you there. I mean, a lot of times I think banks get a bad name or a bad rap for being and loaning, money that people say, well, I lost this house. The bank said I could buy a house that was, X number of dollars. Really, I couldn't afford that. In this case, the bank really is kind of watching out for you to make sure that you can carry both of those payments.
Right. I mean, when it comes down to it, everyone vilified the banks because of all the bad loans they make. And then nowadays, everyone, here we are again, a couple years later, and everyone wants, 100% financing, no money down. They don't want to show income to qualify. So I agree with you. I think that, what the banks are doing is actually looking out for you, right? If you can, as an investor starting out, I'd feel great knowing that if I can qualify for an investment property, that's at the worst case scenario. That means that I'm comfortably able to make both payments on both properties, assuming that I never, ever, ever have a tenant. And so if I do have a tenant, then that's better than the worst case scenario, which, as my wife knows, I'm always thinking about the worst case scenario.
Oh my goodness, I call him the WCF man. He's always talking about the worst case scenario, which is, it's good. Yeah. But, he's, I guess, the man of reason, where I'm the dreamer in our relationship.
Completely true.
But I do think it's important that if you're out there, the audience are your new investors for the most part, and you're probably wondering, all right, that's good to know about qualifying, but how do I know if I can even buy a house? What should I do? I think it's important that we talk about the pre-approval process, because I think a lot of times when it comes to starting to look, or being the dreamer, as I call myself, and spending hours at night online trying to find properties that you're interested in, you find one that you're interested in, you're excited, you call the realtor, you go look at it, and then you haven't even talked to a lender yet to know if you can actually afford it. So I think it's really important that we talk about the whole idea of getting a pre-approval. And really, if you're serious about investing in real estate and buying rental properties, I think it's really important that you start with talking to a lender. Right. It's you can look all you want, you can go and talk to realtors if you want, but unless you know what you can afford, then you're really kind of wasting your time, and you could potentially be wasting your realtor's time, and you don't want to be doing either of those things.
Right. Yeah. And I would agree. And I would, but first I would even say that when you go talk to a lender, if you can find a good lender and get recommendations for somebody that you trust, or that, somebody that your family's used or your friends used before, that can be a good place to start, because even if they say that you don't qualify now, they may have strategies in place to help you get to a point that you can qualify. So like one of the things that we were actually talking about before doing this podcast is that, so many people who start out, trying to invest in real estate, go to a lender and they find out they don't qualify, but they don't ask why. They don't ask, what are the things that I can do to get me in a position to qualify? And as somebody who's taken hundreds and hundreds of applications and met with hundreds and hundreds of clients, I know firsthand that, one of the big things that people have as part of their monthly obligations is a car, right? And sometimes that car payment of $200 or $300, well, that's as much as a payment could be on a small rental or investment property. And so as a certified mortgage planner, I would tell them and say, hey, look, you can't qualify now, but if you sell your car, your really expensive car that you love driving around, is it worth selling that car and buying just a regular car in cash, not having a payment? Then you're able to actually qualify for an investment property. So you have to make those trade-offs. So I think the first thing is when you do talk to a lender to get pre-approved, you want to make sure that, they're looking out for you and get you on the right track. If you're not there yet, make a game plan so that you can, at some point in the future, get ready to buy an investment property.
So I think that's a really good point that you bring up because, let's be real. Most of us aren't sitting around with lump sums of cash sitting in the bank ready to just invest, right? We are saving money, hopefully at a decent rate throughout the course of the year, but we don't have a ton of cash that we can just go put down and buy a property. With traditional financing, we have to put 20% down, which we'll kind of get to a little bit later on. So I think it's a good thing that you start thinking about getting creative. And like you said, having a good mortgage planner can start giving you tips on how to be creative. Where can you cut back in your current budget to, start saving some of that money? The latte factor always comes into my mind. But where can you cut back and start saving some of that money, maybe then to get to the point to be able to put down 20% on a property, so being able to kind of be reflective on where you can save money in your overall budget can also help in terms of being able to qualify and being able to have a down payment.
Right. Yeah. And I think, one quick little example is if you had a really expensive car that also carried a really expensive or high monthly payment, what if you just sold your car and bought a cheaper car, so you've got some extra leftover cash from selling that expensive car. So you've got some cash to also put in towards a down payment or kind of help with the down payment saving. Plus, you've gotten rid of that monthly car payment, which helps you qualify for more properties that might fit what you're trying to do with your investment goals.
Right. So it's a win-win.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about what goes into getting a pre-approval because it is a little bit of a process. And although some people think it's a little bit tedious because there are lots of documents and things like that you have to gather and then give to your lender, I think it's important for people to know what goes into that so they know.
Right. So generally there's a big distinction out there between a pre-qualification and a pre-approval. So a pre-qualification is basically hearsay. And that's basically somebody calling and saying, well, I make, X number of dollars. And then the lender would say, okay, well, based on what you say, you could qualify for X loan amount or X property. But a pre-approval is a lot more in depth. You're going to actually submit documents to your lender or to your mortgage broker, pay stubs, bank statements, W-2s, tax returns. You're going to submit all that stuff up front. And frankly, you want to submit all that stuff up front. The last thing you want to do is go through, like Emily said before, find a house, write a contract. God forbid you even get under contract and now are legally bound to buy that house and you haven't gone through this process of talking to a lender to get approved. You could be liable and facing lawsuits for breach of contract and non-performance. So I think the process of going through a pre-approval, even though it does seem a little bit more tedious with submitting documents, is actually kind of a good, trial run at getting organized with your finances and, getting everything in place so that you can buy a rental property.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like I said earlier in the show, I said about that really should be your first stop. Find your lender. If you're serious about investing, find a lender and get that pre-approval done because you're just going to save a ton of time and you're going to know whether or not this is even a road that you can go down at this point, which can be so beneficial.
Right. And even if you have all your documents in place and ready to go, and that's all on you, right? The longer you take to get things together, but with a good lender, they can get you pre-approved for a property in about a day or two. So if you send them all of your documents, it doesn't take them 30 days to look through everything. They can get you pre-approved and look through all of your documents as long as you've got them in order in about a day or two. So ask yourself, is it worth it to spend a day or two with the lender getting everything in order so then you can confidently go out there and look for your next property?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we should talk a little bit about the type of financing that investors go after. So I mentioned earlier that if you are going to use traditional financing, you're going to use conventional.
Correct.
And it's going to be 20% down.
In most cases,
In most cases, yes. I know there are some programs out there. I can think of one off the top of my head, like HomePath.
Right, which we've used before.
Right, and so that is one where investors actually only have to put 10% down, which is pretty awesome, because that saves you 10%. HomePath is pretty sweet too, because you can work in a renovation. You can work your renovations into the loan, and so if you buy something, those properties are usually pretty distressed, so they usually do need a little bit of work to get them up to par. But that's one of those programs out there that is a little bit different than the normal, typical, conventional financing. But for today's sake and for, when we talk about it, we can always assume that we're talking about 20% down.
Right. And I think that when it comes to conventional financing, there's really 3 types of conventional financing that's out there, and they're really not too different, but you might hear words changed as you go through and start talking to banks. So real quickly, there's your conventional loan, which is, that's what it's called. It's called a conventional loan. So don't misplace that word for something else in the market. So the conventional loan is a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac loan, and it basically requires 20% down for all investors. Depending on your credit score, you may actually have to put a little bit more down. But then there's also some construction or renovation loans. So if you actually find a property that needs a little bit of work and it's not a HomePath property, you can do a construction or renovation loan where the bank will help finance the purchase of the property and the renovation or construction on top of that. But again, still requires 20% down based on the total cost. So the cost to buy the property and the cost of doing the renovation, they add those together, and you got to put 20% down on top of that. And then the third one that's kind of thrown in that conventional mix is what's called a portfolio loan. So these are loans that are not sold to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These are loans that the bank will actually hold on its books in-house. So it's very similar to you loaning money to one of your family members, and they owe you money and you're not going to sell that note. You're just going to keep it, and they're going to keep making payments to you. So again, those portfolio loans can be very different among different banks, right? All the different banks have different risk tolerances, and they have different goals and different properties they want to invest in, but generally you're going to find the same thing. It's between 20 and 25 or 30% down plus with those portfolio loans.
Yeah, and I think that might be a good time that you bring up the portfolio loans to kind of talk about the notion of when those come into play, right? So whenever you are working as an investor, most banks are going to lend on investment properties up to 4 properties, right? So let's say you own an owner-occupant home, you're living in it, and then you own 2 rental properties, you're looking to buy a 4th one. Once you buy that one, after that, most banks are potentially not going to lend to you traditionally, in the traditional sense that we're talking about here. And this is kind of where the portfolio loans come in, because after 4, you become much more, face it, you become much more of a risk for a bank. And so guidelines become stricter, less banks are going to lend, and a lot of times this is where the portfolio lending will come into play. If you are able to go in and you have a loan package, then you're able to put up a better case for getting a portfolio loan from a bank, because they are going to hold it on their books. So they're going to want to see more documentation, more history in terms of other rentals that you own.
Right. You're going to want to make a good impression on the bank, right? Because they're loaning you money directly out of their pocket. And this is where I think most people have this misconception that if a bank denies you or if they can't do a loan, that it's, they don't want to give you money. But in most conventional financing, the bank is actually selling the mortgage off to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac in the secondary market. So they're just an intermediary between Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and all these government entities to actually get you a loan. So they do have their own guidelines, because they're going to keep the servicing on the loan themselves and track your payments and do all that stuff. So they do have their own guidelines. But generally, it's not really money that they're going to hold on their books for a long, long period of time. And I think this is also, where we talked about a little bit before, the max number of properties that you can finance as an investor. And that's the magic number right now is 4 properties. And sometimes you'll actually hear out in the marketplace maybe that banks can do up to 10 properties. But I'm here to tell you, as a mortgage planner, that is the guideline. The guideline right now with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is that they will allow up to 10 properties. So everyone's thinking, well, if they allow up to 10 properties, why don't the other banks allow up to 10 properties? And it's because those banks have their own guidelines over top of it. So it's kind of like this hamburger effect, right? You have, a base guideline, and then another bank throws another guideline on top, and then another one, and then another one. And now you have to comply with all of them. And so almost all of the banks that you'll find out there require that you only have up to 4 financed properties. So the key word there is finance, right? You can have as many unfinanced properties as you want, so as many properties as you want, free and clear. But for investors and for our sake of this podcast and discussion, the max right now is 4. So we're going to help you guys get to those 4 properties.
Yeah, and I always like to use analogies. Being a teacher, I like to use analogies to the teacher. But you're talking about the different types of guidelines, right? So I think about a school. A school in itself has rules that kids have to follow. But then within a classroom, the teacher has rules that they have to follow. So the kids have to follow both of these guidelines, the teacher's guidelines and the school's guidelines.
And then at home, the husband has to follow a different set of guidelines.
That's right. You've got 3 sets of guidelines. And your wife's a teacher, so watch out.
Right.
But no, so I always like to throw in that analogy to help it make sense, this idea of the guidelines that are out there in relation to financing.
Right, yeah. And that's, again, where, finding the right mortgage broker or mortgage lender is going to come into play.
Well, I think there's some things that we should go back to that we hit on earlier that we mentioned we should chat about.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things is, we should probably talk about this whole 2-year requirement for holding rental property.
Oh yeah, I think that's a good place to start, because it's something that I really think it's kind of that's another golden number, are those 2 years. So the whole idea with the 2 years is that you have to have 2 years of rental history on your tax returns in order for the income that you produce from a rental property to count as qualifying income whenever you go to qualify for a loan. So let's just say we own 2 rental properties for the sake of the story right now, and we are just coming up on 2 years of owning them. If I went in, let's say 3 months shy of owning those for 2 years, and I went to the mortgage planner, Kirk, and I said, I want to buy another rental property. Look, I have both of these rental properties. They're both bringing in, I'm making $800 a month, net after all expenses on both of these properties. That's bringing in X number of dollars for the year. I should totally be able to qualify for another property.
Right. And that's a good point, because people come in there, at least they come into my office and say, hey, I'm making all this money. How come I can't qualify? But the 2-year mark that you brought up is really good, because the 2 years is important for banks because it shows consistency, right? We want to see on your tax returns, so not a profit loss statement that you make. We want to see them on your tax returns. We want to show a 2 complete year history of you being a landlord. That way we feel comfortable knowing that income is going to continue into the future, and that maybe this one-time event wasn't just a fluke.
Right. Yeah. And that was something that I was completely clueless. I mean, let's be real. I was clueless about most of this stuff when we started, but that was something that I totally did not know anything about, because when we were in that boat and we were waiting, it was before we had the properties for 2 years. I was gung-ho and ready. We were making money off our first 2 properties. I was ready to go buy another property. And Kirk, of course, voice of reason, had to bring me down and say, oh, Emily,
gotta wait.
It doesn't work like that. Right. We need to show that as income for 2 years on our tax returns.
Right. But this is really cool because, if you kind of think long term about investing in real estate, this becomes a snowball effect in your investing, right? After those 2 years, you have properties that are generating some PCF, or positive cash flow. And that positive cash flow can then self-finance. It's like you have another job that's making income. That other job of investing can then self-finance new properties that you add to your portfolio. So without going out and making more money in your job, feeling like you need to make more money to own more properties, you just got to get this ball started. It may take some time to get started. It may take the first 2 years before you buy your second property, but that's okay. You want to do it the right way, and you want to, build something that's going to last.
Yeah, something that's sustainable and not something that's just going to blow up at any moment. I do think that we should talk a little bit about separating assets. Now, Kirk and I have done something a little bit different, maybe some would say, in terms of the way that we've gone about purchasing our rental properties. With both of us having jobs, being employed, being able to qualify. When we bought the first property that we owned, I bought that myself. Under my name, I was able to qualify. That was way back when it was the
2009.
home buyers. What was the name of that? Home buyers tax credit, something
credit relief.
Some credit relief. It was great because I got a bunch of free money for it. And we lived there long enough that we didn't have to pay it back, so that was even better. So we had that property under our name and we lived in that. And then when we went forward and actually started into the investing and buying rental properties, we decided that we wanted to put those just in Kirk's name. We really we're trying to go about separating our assets. And I think that's something that is important, or maybe just a tip. Maybe it's something that you never really thought about before, and how you can attack going and getting rental properties. That whole only being able to finance 4 properties was something that we really kind of thought about ahead of time. And that was part of the reason why we decided to separate the properties the way that we did, so that we actually could potentially get 8 properties between the 2 of us, depending on qualifying.
Right. Yeah. And I think, real quick, separation of assets is important because, of obviously legal and liability factors that come into owning real estate. If somebody hurts themselves, you don't want that lawsuit coming back to affect your family. So, separation of assets, something you should talk to your CPA or your attorney about, just to make sure. And we can probably do a podcast on it later, with some more in-depth details. But when it comes to actually, qualifying, actually separating out what you or your significant other, if you're investing with your significant other, do, can actually sometimes help. So, kind of going back to an example of qualifying. So I usually have sometimes, 2 couples, a husband and wife, that'll come in and they want to invest in property. And if we look at their numbers as everything in one pot, so we throw his income and her income and all the debts together, we find out that they don't qualify. But when we do a little bit more digging, maybe we find out that a lot of the debt that family has is maybe only in the husband's name. So the car's in his name for some reason, or the house is in his name for some reason, or the credit cards are in his name or her name or whatever. It doesn't have to be his or hers. But we find out that a lot of the debt is one-sided. And so what that does is it leaves the other person open to buying a property on their own. So if the wife in this example had great income, but she was not on any of the monthly debts that are tied to that house, then we could potentially buy an investment property only under her name. And that's a good way to, 1, qualify, but then also 2, separate out your assets, because the guidelines only talk about financing 4 properties per person. So when you really think about it, and I think this is where we were kind of thinking when we, originally started doing this, is that we started doing properties under my name so that now I'm maxed at 4, but Emily still has 3 left over in her name. So we could potentially get 8 properties still keeping under that 4 max.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely something, if you hadn't thought about it, to think about. If you're just starting out, how you want to go about. The last thing you want to do is get down the road a couple of properties and be 4 deep and have it under, whether you're investing with a spouse, investing with a partner, however you're doing it, and realize and look back and say, oh man, I wish we would have done it a different way, because I know that that's one of the things right now that's driving me crazy. My dorsal fin is popping out, as my husband likes to call it, is that I don't have the tax returns with the rental properties under Kirk's name. He has that rental history. Now we have one of them under my name, but it's just turned into a rental just, in the last couple of months. And so for me to be able to qualify, it's making it a little bit more difficult because that's not seen as income to qualify. So that's driving me crazy. That's one of the things that I'm struggling with right now and wanting to continue to grow our portfolio. But we're, having to kind of deal with that because we're kind of tapped out on Kirk's end.
Right. Yeah. Look, it's a challenge, but I think people can get through it. So I know we've talked about so much stuff and kind of, covered a lot of different topics and touched on different things. So why don't we just quickly summarize as we're kind of winding this down, kind of what we talked about and how people can really get started financing that first investment property.
Absolutely. So I think some of the key things that we talked about in this podcast, number 1, you need to meet with a lender. It's so important to find. And, I really think one of the best ways is to get a referral. Ask around, my husband and his team, his mom and dad, they've totally worked on referral basis. That's talk to somebody that you trust and find out who they're using. I think that's one of the best ways to go about finding one. But when you meet a lender, go meet with them and get a pre-approval done. Be diligent about getting your documents in. The faster that you get those things in, the faster that they can get you a number. So know that really the timing and the ball is in your court when it comes to that. But I can't stress enough about how your first step should really be to get a pre-approval to know really where you can go with this. After that, start thinking about saving for a down payment. If you don't have, if you're planning to go traditional financing and getting a conventional loan, in most cases, you're going to need 20% down. So if once you find out what your pre-approval, what you can actually afford or what you can qualify for, that's going to let you know what you're going to need for a down payment. So best case scenarios, you got to start saving for it. If you have to get creative on ways to cut back in your regular life or on your budget, if this is important enough for you, you're going to do it. That's really the truth of it, is that if this is something that you want to do, you'll make it happen. And I think that's something that we've learned through this process. And then think and plan ahead. Think about how you want to structure your portfolio. We talk so much about structuring the deal and running numbers and things like that. But I think it's so important that if you're just starting out, this is such an advantage for you to think about this and to know about this ahead of time. Think about how you want to structure your portfolio. Like Kirk and I mentioned, the way that we kind of separate our assets with properties under his name, properties under my name. That's one of the ways that we've gone about doing it for, the ability to grow the portfolio the way we want it to.
Right. And I think, on top of that really quick is laying out some goals, right? I mean, we actually just did this in the car heading down to Virginia a couple weeks ago, but we laid out some 1, 3, and 5 year goals about where we wanted to be with our portfolio and the growth of our rental properties. And then on top of those goals is lay out some action steps, right? I mean, kind of divide and conquer. Get somebody to help out, whether that's a spouse or your husband and wife or your mother, father, brother, sister, whoever, but get somebody to help out with some action steps to keep you accountable in working towards that goal.
Yeah, setting goals. Oh man, I could do a whole podcast on that right now. Just going back to the whole notion of, I think before you do anything, even before you even get to the financing, you need to set goals and
right.
You need to figure out where you're going.
Yeah.
I always use the analogy, if you're going somewhere new, you don't get there without a GPS or a map, right? You got to know where you're going, and your goals are going to get you there when it comes to real estate investing. And think about it. When you're driving down a road and you're going somewhere new, worst case scenario, if you don't have a map, you're going to get lost. But in real estate, worst case scenario is you're going to lose a ton of money.
Not good. Tweetable.
Yeah, exactly.
Tweeting.
You're going to lose a lot of money. So, I caution you in that. But I think since we're winding down now and we're going to close it out, the last thing I'm going to do with any guest, although Kirk will probably be a reoccurring guest on the podcast for various topics that we're going to talk about. But since this is one of the earlier shows, let's go ahead and take you through the raft round.
Let's do it.
All right. So for those of you, again, if you're new to the podcast, the raft round, this is at the end of any time we have a guest on the show. I ask them for 4 things. Raft coming from my English teaching background. It's an activity I used to do in my classes. But we're going to ask Kirk for 4 things. Read, R standing for read. I want to know his favorite book related to real estate investing or business. A piece of advice that you'd like to share with our listeners. F, a failure that you've encountered through this process. And then T is a tool. What kind of tool or resources out there that has been beneficial for you? So what do you got for us?
Okay, so for read, I think the biggest, I think everyone's always obviously read Rich Dad Poor Dad. I think that's obviously a great book to start out with. Not even just about real estate, but just about how you should structure, kind of businesses that you have. But the book that I'm actually reading right now, holding in my hand, I've got a highlighter in the middle of the book that I'm can attest to.
A million notes because
that's just how
and then he types them, and he's a little bit of a nerd like that.
And I am a little bit of a nerd like that. But the book that I'm reading right now, which I think is honestly an awesome book, is called The Compound Effect by Darren Hardy. And hopefully you can link to it in the show notes. Yeah. But I think The Compound Effect really is a good book for real estate investors, because even though it doesn't talk about real estate, it talks about doing these little activities that over time build and build and build upon themselves. And then you look back one day, and you find out that you have, this massive portfolio of real estate. So I think that's a really great book to read, and it's talking about the activities you should be doing.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure to link to that in your show notes. Advice, what do you got?
So I think for novice real estate investors, I think my biggest piece of advice is to know your numbers, is be confident in your numbers, overestimate on the things that are going to be expenses, and underestimate on things that are going to come in as income. As we talked about before, I'm a worst case scenario kind of person. So I will always overestimate on expenses and underestimate on income. And if the deal still makes sense at that point, then I know I've covered my bases on both ends.
Failure. What do you got?
Okay, so I got a really good story, and you'll probably remember this, but I think our biggest failure actually happened with our second investment property that we had. And we had a tenant that was not so good, and we actually were coming up to the end of the lease. We decided not to renew the lease with these guys because they just, had a lot of trouble paying, and it was a couple months that they hadn't paid, and they were always late on their payments, and we really kind of let them slide because of the family situation. And they weren't family, but they had a family and a little girl and baby and everything. So we wanted them, to do right by them. And at the end of it, when they were moving out, we emailed them, and I stupidly emailed them and said, hey, I'm going to be coming to meet and collect the keys. And the guy emailed me back and said, well, when am I going to get the security deposit? And this is the failure, is that I emailed him back and said, well, you're not getting the security deposit, right? Because you've been late, and these are how many times you've been late. You've never paid the late fee, so, we're taking the security deposit back. Well, I really never should have done that, because when we actually got to the property, he was never there. We never found him. They just kind of left it there. And we actually got to the property, and the doors were wide open, right? I mean, they were completely wide open. I have no idea how long the property was completely wide open. Anybody could have come in and trashed it. And thankfully, it wasn't as bad as, we thought it was going to be. But that's something I won't do ever again, is I won't tell anybody through email that they're not getting their security deposit back. I'll tell them face to face when I go collect the keys.
Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely one of those things where we walked in and we looked at each other and we went, we're not doing that again, right?
Yeah, that was a lesson.
It definitely was a lesson, and hopefully a lesson that we can share with you so that you don't make that same mistake. All right, last one, a tool or resource, website, anything.
Rentalrookie.com. I mean, of course.
Are you putting in a plug for me?
That's a crazy plug, but I have to. I think that the biggest tool that you can use as a beginning investor is to get a spreadsheet. So whether you get one of the spreadsheets, the property analyzer at Rental Rookie, and download that and start using that, because we kind of, built it together and made sure that it had, everything in there that you need to start analyzing deals. But don't use all those other tools that are out there. Just use a simple spreadsheet. Make sure that you understand what calculations go into it. You understand the math, because all those other fancy bells and whistles just make all these numbers in pretty formats and pretty pie charts and line graphs, but it really comes down to the numbers. So if you understand those, you'll be better off. So I say stick with Excel. You'll be just fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great pieces of advice. And again, we'll link to some of those things in the show notes. That way, if you want to access some of those things or get links to them or buy the book or things like that, you can do that. But I think that about wraps it up for today. I really hope that you took away some information and some insight related to traditional financing. I appreciate my husband coming on, Kirk being here and sharing the perspective from the lender side. We are still new in the shows and the podcast, but this is exactly what I plan on, you'll be seeing in the future, are not only in interviewing investors who are investing real time right now, but people who are related to the business, lenders, real estate agents, contractors, CPAs. They give a lot of insight. We can learn a lot from investors and what they're doing and how they're structuring deals and those sorts of things. But there are so many other people who are involved in this business that it's really beneficial to get insight from them and their relationship to real estate investing and rental properties and landlording, because it just provides us with much more information and insight on what to do and how to do it properly. So, as always, I hope you enjoyed the show and happy investing.
Thanks for listening to the Rental Rookie Podcast. We love helping people invest in rental properties, so feel free to spread the word about our podcast. Rate us on iTunes, leave us a comment, or share us with your network. Learn more at rentalrookie.com.